As artists, we keep a library of alphas and stamps that we use to create our custom brushes. Now, the problem can be that, say, creating something like a scratch, we have to use maybe different alphas to create variation and save different brush presets. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use Substance Designer to create a dynamic brush that we can use in Substance Painter. And what that means is this dynamic brush is going to vary the shape of the scratch for the alpha as we paint each stroke. So let's jump in and take a look. This is the graph that we're going to be creating in this video. So if I come over to my random seed and just click this button, you can see that this graph will create just random versions of this scratch. Again, all driven by random seed. So let's jump in and see how we can create this node by node. So to start, I am going to create a shape node. And for the pattern, I am going to set this to ridged bell. And now I have my size for X and Y. Let's set the X value to 0.01. And the Y at 1, you can see I get this really thin line. It's going to be perfect for the scratch. Now, the parameters that I can start to play with would be, for example, the Y axis, which is going to derive the overall length of the scratch. And then I also have my angle control, which is going to allow me to rotate this. Now, instead of just exposing the angle and the Y as parameters that I would have to change individually, I'm going to connect them to a single value that's going to be driven by random seed. So to do that, I am going to use a value processor. Now, this node is super powerful. What it does is it allows me to create a function graph that would be accessible to any node. So here I'll click the edit button. This jumps into the function graph. And what I want to do is just create a random value. So I will create the random node. This is going to create a random value between 0 and whatever float value I enter. So we're going to create a float value. We're going to set it to 1, make the connection, and then set this random node as the output. And here in the 2D view, you can see that it's already starting to compute this random value. What's also nice about the value processor is it gives me this kind of visual representation of the data, and I can see that just at a quick glance here in the graph. Now, if I come over to my random seed and I just click the randomize button, you can see indeed it is creating a random value between 0 and 1. That's perfect. Okay, so whenever you have a value processor and you want to take this value and feed it into a node, you just simply need to come over to the node itself. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the instance parameters, there's this section called input values. Now, all you need to do is just click this little plus button, and that creates for you an input value. You can see I now have this input pin, and there is a setting here where you can change the name of this input value. I just typically leave it at input, that's fine. And then your drop down, you can choose what data type you want to work with. Like in my case, I'm going to use float, and I have a float value from my value processor, so I'll just make this connection. And just like that, we're able to now use this information from the value processor within any of the instance parameters. So a really quick way to do this would be to just replace the angle slider with this input value, which is this random seed. So all I need to do is come over here to this button that allows me to expose parameters. It's getting cut off in the screen capture, but if I click this drop down, there is an option towards the bottom that says use node input value, and it says input, which is the name of this input value. I'll just choose that option. So now you can see that if I come over to the value processor and I start to click the random button, now that rotation is being driven by this random seed value. This is exactly what I want to do. Now let's take this one step further and let's take a look at how we can have this input drive the Y axis of this size parameter. Now with the size, I can see that this is going to be a vector float value because it is two values, an X and Y. So just keeping that in mind, I'm going to click this button and choose the second option, which is empty function. Now I can start working with an empty function. First thing I need to do, I'm going to hit the space bar and choose get float. And this is going to allow me to get a float value. And if I click my drop down here, you can see that that input that I set for the node is available for me to use. So as I mentioned, this size value is an X and Y. So it's two values. That means it's a vector 2. That's what I need to create for my output. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose a vector float 2 as this node, because this is going to be the final output. And the two pins, think of the first one as X and the second one as Y. And I know for the X value, I'm just going to keep that basically set at 0.01. So I'm going to create a float. We'll set this to 0.01. And I can go ahead and just plug that into the X value. That's set. I don't really want to change that. Now for the input, if I jump out really quick and take a look, and you can see this already here for this particular snapshot in time of this random value, it's a value of 0.06. So if I look at this value in terms of my Y length, this 0.06 is going to be so small. It's essentially going to be 0 length for the scratch. And I don't really want that. That's going to be too small. So what I'm going to do is set a minimum and maximum value and do an interpolation between those two values driven by that random seed. And to do that in Designer, it's quite simple. We have a helper node that does that called linear interpolation. So now I can take my input value, which is just my random seed. We'll plug that into the third pin. And now I just need to set my range. So I'm going to create 2 floats. So we have a float. I can just simply copy and paste this guy and get a second one. And let's plug these in. So this will be my minimum and my maximum value. So for the maximum value, I'm going to set this just a little bit above 1, so 1.2, so we can make this just slightly larger than the default value. And then for the minimum value, this is basically saying how small do I want this scratch to be. In my case, I don't really want it to go below 0.5. So now that this is set, these nodes will represent the Y value for my size, and I can just plug this right into that vector float 2 second input, and then right click the vector float 2 and set that as my output. So if we go back to our graph and we double click our shape node, let's take a look at the process. So we'll go over to the value processor. I'm going to randomize, and you can see that as I click through this random seed, we're now getting the exact behavior that we want. The scratch is rotating randomly, and it's also varying the length based on that size parameter. So some scratches are smaller and some are larger. And this is precisely what I want to do to drive my overall scratch. Now we want to start to add a little bit of character to this scratch. So let's start by creating a warp, and let's take the shape and plug that into the input. Now we need some type of gradient input for this. Let me just move these nodes up. And what I like to use for warps in this particular case is a Perlin noise. And we're going to use this as our gradient input. Now, if we take a look at the warp, you can see, well, the intensity value is crazy high. So let's just drop this down. And with just a slight subtle effect, you can see I'm using something really low, like 0.05. We start to get some nice kind of waviness here to the scratch. And this is precisely what I want to work with. Okay, so we have one level of this, but I'd like to take this even further, and let's add just another kind of level of distortion to this. And another great node for this is if we use the multi-directional warp grayscale node. So let's plug the warp into the input, and now we need to set an intensity input. So for this, what I'm going to do is create another version of my shape node. And for the pattern, I'm going to set this to, let's just try paraboloid to start. And I'm going to leave everything at default. Let's just see what this does. So if I take the output, we'll plug that into the intensity input for the multi-directional warp. Let me zoom in so we can get a good view of this. And if we start to increase the intensity, you can see, well, something's happening. Let's set this to a pretty high value, like maybe 75. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm starting to see something here. This is super faint. So before we go any further, why don't we just reprocess some of these value ranges, just so we can more clearly see what this is doing. So for this process, I like to use a curve node, and we are going to take the result of this directional warp, plug it into the curve, and now we have our curve editor. Let's take a good look at this guy here. And I'm just going to plot a point right in the middle and just create basically this nice little kind of curve here. And you can see that as I'm starting to adjust these values, I'm already lifting the overall kind of value range of this particular result that I'm getting. So this looks pretty good. I like that I can get some nice little fall off here towards the ends and essentially kind of thickening the middle. And again, I can just keep playing with this curve node to get precisely what I want to do here. So for now, I think we'll just go with something that looks kind of like this. That looks pretty good. So let's jump back to that multi-directional warp now that we can see what we're doing. So we can see that we have this intensity value here, and we also have a warp angle, which is kind of interesting. So in and of itself, this is already producing kind of a neat effect. We have a mode here, which is set to average, and directions. So if I set this to 2 directions, we get 2 results or 2 lines. If we set it to 4, we can get 4 lines. And the way this is blending is really comes down to this average setting. So we have a couple options. You have like maximum, you have minimum, and we have chain. Now, chain is what I want to use in this particular case. And you can see that this is the result that I'm getting. And I can control this by playing with the intensity value. And like I said, I think I'm going to keep this. Well, let's just try 70. And then I also have this warp angle that I can play with as well. So this is already distorting this scratch kind of on an extra level on top of what we had originally with our warp. Now, something else that's pretty cool about this is if I have my shape here, this is the intensity value. If I were to move this around, it's also going to affect the multi-directional warp result. So to showcase that, let me just select this line here, this connection line, and I'm going to create a transform node. And let's just double click our curve because we want to see this final output. I'll single click on the transform, and now check this out. If I grab the transform and start to move this around, now I'm starting to get even more varied results. Now, you can see there's basically kind of a range that I want to work with here. Now, I want to set up some thresholds for this transformation, because if I move it too much in one direction, you can see it's going to artifact, it's going to start trying to repeat, it's just going to break the overall effect. So if I look at this, if I move this transform, close to around maybe if I'm just looking at my X value here, around 0.23 to 0.25, that looks pretty good. And then I can move this up and down on the Y. However, if I were to just take this value and constrain it to maybe a circular pattern, this could produce some pretty interesting results. And that is going to give me kind of an interesting way to work, again, with the random values that are coming from this value processor. So that's what I'm going to do here with this transform. And so what we'll do with this is I know that on the transform, I want to take this X and Y value and essentially plot that into a circle. So to do that, I'm going to come over here to this drop down and I'm going to create yet another empty function. Actually, one step I forgot to do before that is I need to create an input pin because I want this to always be driven by that random value. So just as I showed earlier, I'm going to come over to my input values, click the plus button. I'm just going to leave the name at the default. It is a float value. I have my input pin. Let's grab that value processor and plug that in so that we can use that as part of the transform as well. Okay, so now that we have this in place, what we're going to do is jump over to our transform. I already have an empty function here, so we'll click the offset transform tab, and let's start using these values. So first thing I know, I want to get a float because I need to get hold of that input value. So we'll go ahead and create that. Now, the next thing I want to do, as I mentioned earlier, is I want to be able to take that transform and take the X and Y value for that offset and essentially just kind of plot that onto a circle. So to do that, I am going to use a helper node that we have in Substance Designer called the Cartesian node. And this is going to give me two inputs, a rho, which is going to be length or direction, and a theta, which is going to be an angle. Now, for the rho or the length, I already know what that's going to be because I did some tests and I was like, oh, on the X value, I want that to be around 0.25. So all I have to do in this case is create a float. We'll set this to 0.25 and just plug that in and we are done. Now, the next thing we need to do is take a look at how we can set up the angle, which is this theta value. Now, if I just jump back to my graph for just a second, let me grab my shape node here, and I'm going to show you something. We're going to just take a square and just move it down so you can see it. Now, we have this angle slider, and there's two options whenever you have an angle, which is turns and degrees. And notice this, if I grab the turns, it's set to 0. If I set it to 1, it's going to go 360 degrees. So now I know that I have this value that's moving from 0 to 1, and that can be remapped to degrees and go all the way from 0 to 360 degrees. So it just happens that we do have a random value that's being computed that's going from 0 to 1. So that's going to be perfect. That's going to be our input. However, we need to convert this so that it's going to work correctly with our angle. And the Cartesian node is working with 2 pi. So what we need to do is a simple conversion. What we'll do is we'll hit my space bar. I'm going to grab this 2 pi helper function that ships inside of Substance Designer. And then I simply need to just multiply that by that 0 to 1 value. This is essentially going to convert my random value from turns to degrees. So we'll do this. And now all I got to do is just plug this right into the theta, right click and choose set as output. All right, let's go back to Scratch. Let's double click the curve and let's take a look at what we have. So something's going on here. Let's go back to that value processor. and we'll look at our base parameters, random seed. And if I click, now you can see that it is starting to rotate. Let's get a better idea of what this is doing. Let me click the transform itself, and you can see that there's a tiling mode set. I'm going to click this button, choose absolute, and set the tiling to no tiling. Now, if we go back to that value processor and I just click the random seed value, you can see that the X and Y offset value is being used to constrain this transform to a circle. And as I click through the random seed button, you can see that it's randomly doing this. Now, let's go back to our curve and let's see what that's actually creating for us. So we'll click through and you can see, yep, it's producing just some random versions of this scratch. This is exactly what I want to do. Okay, perfect. And like I said, we can also go back to this multi-directional warp, and I can even start to play around with some of these other values like the warp angle, maybe my intensity I want to increase or decrease. You can always play with these values. Something else we could do that would be just interesting is here we have this warp angle again. Why don't we drive that with the value processor just as we've been doing? So what I'll do is click the plus button once again. Let's take that value processor and feed that in. And then I'm just going to replace the warp angle with that input. And now that is being driven as well by our random seed value. So we'll go back, let's click through and just take a look at the results that we're getting. So some of these different versions of this scratch here. Now we could also try different shapes. I can play with the scaling of this and so on and so forth. So what I might do in this particular case is just experiment with setting this value just slightly higher. So 1.2. Now it's breaking. If we take a look, we have a break here. So what I'm going to do is take that tiling mode back to H and V. And now we get this kind of shape pattern. What is that doing? That looks pretty cool. So I think I might just go with that result. Okay, so at this point, with just a few nodes here, we have our system in place. What's the next step? Let's just add one last level of kind of variation here to this scratch. And what I'm going to do is use a slope blur. We're going to create just some slight little chipped edges. So let's add a slope blur here to the curve. And for the slope, I'm going to use a Perlin noise once again. We'll plug this guy into the slope. And the samples needs to be set to 32. The intensity is way too high. Let's bring that down. And the mode is set to blur. What I want to do is set this to max, or I can try min. Let's do max. And now I'm starting to get some of these little edges here. Now what I can do is start to play with that intensity value. Let's just try 0.1. And I can control some of this effect by just adjusting the scale. So what I'm going to do is adjust the scale. So make this not tiling as much on that noise. And what I'm looking for is just, some little edges like this, a little bit of a sloped kind of fall off to create like a little bit of a chipped edge on the scratch. And if we zoom out, you can see that it's subtle, but it just adds that little extra variation, little extra realism to what we're trying to do. So now, once again, let's check this out. Let's come over to our random seed. Let's click our button. And here you can see that now we have a pretty cool effect producing these different versions of this scratch with pretty much little effort. And like I said, if we want to, we can always go back to that slope blur and I can increase the intensity of this. I think I might want to do that. Maybe we'll set it to 0.3. That looks pretty good. And here is our final result. So now we have our graph. And the last thing we need to do is we need to just create an output. Because what I really want to do with this graph, now that I have this random seed value, is now that I have this random scratch, and I want to use this as a dynamic alpha inside of Substance Painter. So what we'll do is we'll create an output. Let's take that slope blur and plug it in. Now for the identifier and the usage, honestly, I don't even need to change any of this. You can set a name if you like, but in this, it doesn't really matter. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it as is. And what I really need to do is just kind of double click in an empty area of my graph. That always takes you to the root level of the graph. And you'll see, I've kind of done this already, but you'll see here under the attributes, there is a type. And if I click this drop down there, by default, it's going to be set to unspecified. And this is particularly useful in your graph whenever you're going to use the send to functionality from Substance Designer to send this graph into another Substance application like Painter or Sampler. Its main use case is when you're creating, just as we're doing here, a texture generator or a filter or something like that. So what we want to do, just so Substance Painter knows what to do with this particular material or graph, I'll say, is we want to click the drop down and we want to set this to a texture generator. That's what we've created here. Now, just so you know, if you were to leave this unspecified, what happens is Substance Painter will look at that and say, oh, it's unspecified, and I just default that to a material, which is definitely not what we want. We just have this kind of alpha map. So like I said, just plug this here or just set the type here to texture generator. Now that that's set, that's really all we need to do. And I'll hit save here to save my package. Now, if I select the package, you'll see that, well, I actually have done this once already. So the send to painter button is available. But if I click this drop down, there is option to publish, and then we have the send to, so we can send it to any of the Substance apps. So the first time I did this, I sent it right to Substance Painter. Now, once I've done that, I have this button, which means if, let's say I come back here to Designer and I start to tweak and change things, I can just click this button and it will reload the texture generator that was sent over to Substance Painter. So what I'll do is I'll click this button. So that's updated Substance Painter. And now let's jump over to Substance Painter and let me show you how you can use this as a dynamic brush. So now we're in Substance Painter and I'm going to show you how we can use our scratch. So here is the scratch graph that was sent over from Substance Designer, and you can see that it includes randomness. So that means we can use this with a dynamic stroke. So I have this default kind of painted material here that's revealing some metal underneath of it. Let's create a new layer on top of this, and we'll call this scratches. And I am going to just set a few parameters. Let's lower the base color slightly, and we'll increase our metallic value and maybe lower the roughness. And then we're going to mask this layer. So I'll create a black mask and then add a paint effect. So it's going to remember the brush settings that I had previously. So let me come over here to my brush settings. And what I'm going to do is just set all these to 0 so that you guys can get an idea of what I'm working with. So we'll set that to 0. Let's go back here to our alpha. And what I would do to start is just grab my scratch alpha and just drag and drop it here as the alpha input. Now you can see that because we are working with randomness, there is a dynamic stroke field. And here we have some various controls, like random seed type is set to single. So what this does, if I start to paint, you can see that, well, it paints my scratch, but I'm only getting one version of this scratch. This is like using a typical alpha. You know, you have your alpha, it's a scratch, and you're painting with it. So this is kind of the limitation of this effect. Now, what we want to do, though, is we want to come over here and change this random seed type. So we can click this drop down here, and I can choose to randomize per stroke or per stamp. So I'm going to set this to random per stamp. And now if I come in, you can see that it's already changed the tip of the alpha. And so if I just start to paint a stroke here, you can see that it's already creating different versions of that alpha. The rotation and everything is happening, and it's being driven by, again, those settings that we set up inside of the Substance Designer graph. I have no jitter settings on the brush at this point. And then you also have this random sample amount. So it's set to 64 values by default. Think of this as the range or the amount of value that it's going to create, the different variations. Now, the higher you set these variations, so if we set it to like 128, it can have performance impact. Right now, it looks like it's doing okay, but I'm starting to get this random version. And you can see how this is already more powerful than just using a single alpha, because we can get this built-in variation. It's essentially the tip of our brush is just randomly changing as we create a brush stroke. Super powerful. Now, on top of this, what we can do is jump over to the brush settings. And then we also have things like our spacing. I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to increase the size jitter slightly. The flow jitter, I'm going to increase this. Let's increase our angle. And then let's even add some position jitter as well. Now, when I start to paint with this brush stroke, you can see this is the result that I'm getting. So we have the randomization of these jitter settings within Substance Painter on top of the specific randomizations for the alpha. So the alpha stamp, we'll say the tip of the brush is randomly changing and the brush itself is being randomized. And what you get is a really powerful brush that helps us just to create this scratch effect pretty easily. Because we created this as a mask, if I jump over here to the material, I can now change all the material settings. Like for example, I forgot to add some height information. So let's just add a little bit of negative height. So we dig this scratch down into the surface And that just gives it just slightly a little bit more kind of tactility here to what we're working with. We'll jump back to our paint. And again, I can go in and just start painting here, producing some of these scratches, which is pretty awesome. So now I can just right click here in the properties and I can choose to create a brush preset. Now this is going to save all of my brush settings, the jitter settings, my alpha, my random seed type, everything that I have set. It's going to save it as a brush. And that means that I can reuse that brush in any of my Substance Painter projects. So now what I have is this nice dynamic scratch brush that varies the alpha. It also varies the overall settings of the brush itself. And this is going to produce for me a much more varied kind of chaotic result, perfect for a scratch brush. So that concludes this video on creating dynamic brushes using Substance Designer for use in Substance Painter. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.